Welcome back to the third session of Medieval Solutions for Modern Problems with Rabbi Levi Morrow, part of Springsman at Drisha. Sources for today's class were sent out earlier today, and I'm going to post them in chat later once things get underway. And with that, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Kayla. And thank you again to Drisha for hosting this course. Welcome back, everyone. It's really nice having everyone week after week. Excited for tonight's class. The last two classes, we talked about essentially how you know things, right? The philosophical term I dropped was epistemology, right? So the first class was on the way in medieval Jewish thought, truth and religion are not necessarily separate parts of reality. They're different ways of trying to get at the same parts of reality. In the second class, we talked about the importance of trust and how truth always lives in social bonds. So this will be sort of a totally different topic, but related to the question of social bonds, I guess. We're going to talk about the topic of truth and about halacha and morality. We're not going to get down to specific issues where in modern society we feel a tension or clash between halacha and moral values. But I want to talk a little bit about the underlying questions about how we define those things and their interactions and how that can structure how we think about these issues. So that's what we're going to be doing today. As with previous weeks, I want to start with a PowerPoint that will help sort of frame the issue. Share that. So call this class, What Should We Do? Morality, Torah, and History. And this is going to be essentially the structure of the class will be morality and Torah, and then the question of history. And I'll explain that when we get more towards it. I want to start with just a brief introduction by way of what sort of will become one of the classic articles on this topic, at the very least within sort of broad orthodox environment, but also in academic circles. This is sort of it's part of the larger discussion. This is Rav Aaron Lichtenstein's article, Does Jewish Tradition Recognize an Ethic Independent of Halacha? Right, it's published in the 70s. I want to say it's 75. It's part of the birth of in what academic circles is known as the Jewish ethics field. That he's obviously writing this not even in an academic frame necessarily. It's a really interesting article, a really good article. There actually was a recent article on it by Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Zakir, wrote this in Tradition, recognizing of Aaron Lichtenstein's contribution to ethics and halacha, and recognizing being a fun little play on the previous title, right? Does Jewish tradition recognize an ethic? So here we're recognizing Rav Aaron's contribution. And he goes through contextualizing it in Rav Aaron's thought and also importantly pointing out a lot of the responses to it and how responses are pushing back on different issues in the essay and different tensions in it. And we're going to do something a little similar this week. This is essentially the last we've seen of the article. I think I have one small quote from it on the source sheet, but it I wanted to start with it. One, it's a classic article, and people can read it if they like, and I like giving material for personal enrichment, but also because he got something very deep that's going to underlie the first part of the shir, and then I think didn't really look at like a loose end in his article that really appears as a just in the end of one footnote. And just to tell you guys already where we're going, which is the question of can halacha and morality ever contradict, is just not a question most of the Rishonim ever ask. It's not intuitive to them that that would be a problem in a way that it wasn't for most people until relatively recent in cultural history. And we're going to look at the end of today's year at the Rambam, who was really the Rishon to raise this question, exactly because of that word I mentioned earlier, history, and the role history plays. So that's going to be sort of the second half of this year, is looking at the interplay of those elements in the Rambam. Before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about what we sort of have in mind when we talk about morality, right? We're not getting into the field of moral philosophy here, so this is going to be very colloquial. These are just going to use words the way people tend to use them. Anything seems unclear, please ask me about them. But broadly speaking, when people talk about morality, they mean some combination of really two of these three things, maybe the third as well. I put on there because it's a little clearer to have separate out, but those are actions and either values or goals, right? Where the question of what should we do and why should we do it? And then the way the whys are motivate the things we should do and questions like that, right? And so the values and goals is separate because values might suggest doing things because they're inherently valuable or because they serve some sort of greater value, but they don't necessarily accomplish anything that you think is important, versus goals might be that you're doing it to accomplish something, but some version of that question, right? And the second part of what we have to ask when we're trying to talk about the relation between halacha and Torah and morality is like, is it the same thing? Is that the problem? Right? The question of the clash between halacha and morality often seems to take the form of like, well, these are essentially making the same kinds of claims. They're saying you should do things for certain reasons in order to accomplish certain goals, and somewhere in those set of things, they are making they're contradicting each other in an unresolvable fashion. We have to figure out what to do. But the important question that we're going to try and get at is what is it's not just about, oh, we have these sets of things. These are these actions we should do or shouldn't do, and these values or goals we should or shouldn't, desire to fulfill and hold dear. I think part of the question will be what is the relationship between them? Are values always tightly tied to actions or goals always tied to actions, or can there be more complicated relationships between them? And I know I'm speaking very sort of abstractly right now, but this is what we're going to look at in the Rishonim. The way the Rishonim are not just asking like what is morality in some sense, and like assuming that it is identical with Torah or vice versa. What is Torah, and assuming that must be what is moral, but seeing them both as part of some larger question that I've framed as abstractly as possible about like what is right to do or what should we do. And that becomes important because we're going to get to the Rambam, who wants to oppose, on the one hand, right and wrong, or true and false, to good and evil, as if those were two different ways of categorizing actions, which makes things a little confusing. But we'll deal with that when we get to it. And then again, to point ahead to the question of history, is are there any other elements we should be including? Right? So that's our introduction for today. What should we do? Morality, Torah, and history. The first text here is from a thinker we have not really seen. There was a little bit on the first source sheet, but we didn't look at it in detail, which is the Chavot Levavot, Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Pakuda. And he is the one who really makes a big deal of the idea that there are, like much more even than Saadia Gaon, the rational mitzvot, which say mitzvot you're supposed to be doing with your mind in the, let's say, the broadest sense, right? In the sense of all your inner life and your feelings and emotions and your values, right? That these are things that to which the term mitzvah applies. But much like Rav Saadia Gaon, as we saw 2 classes ago, he sees morality as part of the sort of God-given world of things that are true. And so he says, he's talking about his distinction between, he calls duties of the limbs and duties of the heart. He's going to break duties of the limbs, which we typically think of mitzvot, right? Actions you're supposed to do, down into 2 categories. He says the duties of the limbs likewise fall into 2 divisions. The first consists of precepts which reason would have dictated, even if the Torah had not made them obligatory. The second, precepts received on the authority of revelation, which reason neither obligates nor rejects, such as the prohibition of milk with meat. Similar precepts whose reason for being prohibited is obligatory are unknown to us. The duties of the heart, however, are all rooted in rational principles, right? So these rational principles that undergird both, like all of the mental and emotional and mitzvot, all of the mitzvot that govern our inner lives, they're totally rational, he says. And so too, a good chunk of the mitzvot that dictate our bodies. They're part of what's called a reason, but reason is in this broad sense that includes also morality and moral intuitions, what we would call natural morality. Right. So the Chavot Levavot says, look, this is just like morality is just included in the Torah. Right, is just part like one subset of the mitzvot is to do the things that morality says you should do. And it's not included in the mitzvot. He's saying because like, oh, there's a mitzvah to be a good person in some broad sense. It's like, right, that's what the halachot are telling you to do. They're telling you to do things that morality also tells you to do. They have a sort of total overlap in that sense. And then also there are other mitzvot that aren't obviously moral, they don't contradict morality either. Right. So that is in some ways like the basic position amongst most of the Rishonim, that morality is sort of built into halacha, and also halacha goes beyond it in certain ways. Not in being more moral or in those ways, not going beyond necessarily in that sense, but just in the sense of like, oh yeah, there's also other stuff in halacha. So that I want to look at one little quote from Rav Aaron, who sort of captures that dichotomy, and then look at the ways in which other the other parts of the Torah try and be more, or like other Rishonim try to be more expansive. So he says traditional halachic Judaism demands of the Jew both adherence to halacha and commitment to an ethical moment, though different from halacha, is nevertheless of a piece with it and its own way fully imperative. And this is sort of the place Rav Aaron ends up at the end of the day, which is that halacha is both like it has its own set of obligatory actions it wants you to do. And then it says also there's this thing called ethics or morality you also have to follow. That is outside of it, but also of a piece with it, somehow connected to it and the same as it, but also different. And if that seems like a confusing line to try and figure out where exactly it falls, like what is to be different but of a piece, he ends the article by saying, look, it's just a matter of how you define the term halacha, like how expansive you want to get, and everyone defines their terms and like the pieces will fall where they may. But so he himself recognizes that this distinction is not a clear one. But what I want to get at in these next couple of sources is exactly sort of the way certain Rishonim see halacha as, I would say, pointing outside itself, right? And I will come back to ask you guys how much you think that what they're pointing at should be thought of as of a piece with halacha, or as halacha being somehow in relationship to sets of values or actions outside of itself. So this first text is a relatively famous piece by the Ramban, Maimonides, the biblical commentator and Kabbalist. I'm actually going to look at two pieces from the Ramban. This is from his commentary on Vayikra, on the commandment to be holy. Kedoshim Tihu should be holy. He brings in a very, very long comment. I brought some of the pieces of it here from the English translation available on Sefaria. He says, the meaning thereof is as follows, meaning the meaning of you shall be holy. The Torah has admonished us against immorality and forbidden foods, but permitted sexual intercourse in man and his wife, and the eating of certain meat and wine. If so, a man of desire should consider this to be permission to be passionately addicted to intercourse with his wife or many wives, and be among wine bibbers or among gluttonous eaters of flesh, and speak freely all profanities, since this prohibition has not been expressly mentioned in the Torah, and thus he will become a sordid person within the permissible realm of the Torah. And the Hebrew there is a great phrase, is naval b'rshuta Torah. A disgusting person with the permission of the Torah. Therefore, after having listed the matters which God prohibited altogether, Scripture followed them up by a general command that we practice moderation even in matters which are permitted, right? So the Ramban is looking at what's happening in this parak of Vayikra and in previous chapters of Vayikra, and seeing that it deals with questions of desire, and saying that the Torah allowed a significant amount of desire and said, also, be moderate. That's in some ways what the mitzvah of Kedoshim Tihiyu means. Even in the things that are technically permitted, be moderate. He should also sanctify himself to self-restraint by using wine in small amounts, just as the scripture calls a Nazir holy for abstaining from wine and strong drink. The Nazir, the person who makes a vow to not cut their hair, not have wine, and so the things like that, the Ramban is saying that that's definitely a good thing. That's something valorous about that. There is a sense of holiness involved in the choice to abstain even beyond what people normally abstain from. And you should remember the evils which the Torah mentioned as following from drinking wine, the cases of Noah and Lot, right? It's two stories from Bereshit where people get drunk and bad things happen. Likewise, he should guard his mouth and tongue from being defiled by excessive food and by lewd talk, similar to what Scripture states, "In every mouth speaketh wantonness." It is with reference to these and similar matters that this general commandment, "You shall be holy," is concerned, after God had enumerated all the individual deeds which are strictly forbidden. Right, so here we have essentially the same basic dichotomy we talked about before in terms of actions and values. Right, there are certain values that the Torah maintains, even if it doesn't think they're necessarily for everyone all the time, or it's not in the most intense form. Right, so like the key value in play here is kedusha, holiness. "You shall be holy" is this general command that takes the form of moderation and as self-imposed abstinence. That to bring the value of kedusha into your life is to choose to refrain from things that you're otherwise allowed to have. Right? And for him, he says the Torah doesn't want that to be the law. Right? There has to that halacha it exists sort of in relation to this value, but doesn't demand it of everyone. Right? I think in many ways this is both a fact of our moral lives and also an uncomfortable one. There's an interesting sort of moral philosophy about the question of moral saints. Do we expect people to be saintly? And saint is a good English translation for a word in Hebrew related to what we're talking about now, that sometimes you'll find in Hebrew literature people referred to as kadoshim or kadoshot, that there could be people who so embody kedusha that we would say in English, they're saintly. And for the Ramban, that is a category of person who exists, and he identifies it here with the biblical category of the Nazir, right? The person who makes this vow to abstain. But the Torah doesn't expect that of everyone, that we're not all supposed to be um, so marked by abstinence that it becomes like a part of who we are. That you could call us a Nazir, a person who's identified as an abstinent person, right? That this is a value that is in some sense really a real value, and also is just not how the world is supposed to work, and not how most people are supposed to be most of the time. Everyone is supposed to realize its value some of the time, but not all the time. And so part of this is about the fact that there seems to be some values are too extreme. Another way of putting that is they're just other values, right? All of the things that the Nazir is abstaining from are also values because the Torah wants you to engage with to varying degrees. And so therefore, the relationship between these different values creates distance between the actions that they might have otherwise pushed you to and the accomplishing the values themselves. Any questions on that piece? Okay. Again, because the English is easily available, also the Hebrew for those who like it, I recommend taking a look. This is a much longer section, so it's worth taking a look at all those different examples and different texts. Yes, Helio.
Hello. Hi, Levi.
Hi.
Exactly this point about, I could say, is about eco-kasher. This is another kind of kasher. Or how you say that's kasher to, okay, you can eat kasher, but food with high level of cholesterol. This is kasher. Or the Chabad Farbrengen, that they drink so much vodka, as it says Haman. Here, this is kasher. Okay, it's halachic, it's kasher, but it's okay.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't want to say signal out any one group, but all of us have different things in our life where you have the ability to go above and beyond what might be good for you or be truly embody sort of the fullest sense of your values, even if you're not technically doing anything wrong. And the Ramban is saying that all people some of the time, and some people all of the time, probably most of us a good portion of the time, should be choosing the more restrained path.
Yes.
I think part of what I want to get at with this piece also, just to take it back to the broader level, is like both about Kedusha as this one specific value Ramban has in mind, but also just to recognize he's saying again, halacha exists in relationship with values that can't themselves be reduced to halacha and might point outside itself in some ways. And I think that will also become clear when we look at the next source. Right, so this is a comment from the Ramban in Sefer Devarim, in the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy. And it's a pasuk that says, "V'asitem et yashar v'hatov." You should do what is right and good, right? And so what the Ramban is going to pick up on is just these two concepts, right? In the previous source, we had the idea of kedusha, of holiness. Here we have the yashar and the tov, that which is right and that which is good. Because the intent of this is as follows. At first, Moshe stated that you are to keep God's statutes and testimonies which God commanded you. And now Moshe is stating that even where God has not commanded you, give thought as well to do what is good and right in God's eyes. For God loves the good and the right. Right? That it is beyond the realm of the specific commandments. There are these two concepts, good and right, and follow those two because God loves those, right? And this is a great principle, for it is impossible to mention in the Torah all aspects of man's conduct with his neighbors and friends, and all a person's various transactions and the ordinances of all societies and countries. But since God mentioned many of them, such as you shall not go up and down a talebearer, you shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge, neither shall you stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, you shall not curse the deaf, you shall not rise up before the hoary head, meaning an old person, and the like, he reverted to a state in a general way that in all matters one should do what is good and right, including even compromise and going beyond the requirements of the law. Thus, a person must seek to refine their behavior in every form of activity until they are worthy of being called good and upright. Tov and Yashar. Right, and here the Ramban is a little clearer about why exactly this is necessary, but I want to flesh this out for a second. Right, this is in the realm of what we typically recognize as morality. Right, the previous text was talking about kedusha, which we will frequently identify with a religion and not always talk about in terms of morality. I think in this area there we need a broad term including both of them. But here he's talking about interpersonal interactions, right? There are some interactions that are good and right and some that are not. And the Torah, he says, tells you a lot of things that are good and right to do, but not all of them, right? He says the reason is it would have been impossible because the Torah is a book, which is to say it's a book with a limited number of words in it. There's enough words that people used to count them and be able to tell you which one was in the middle. And there's a Gemara in Kedushin where the rabbis are discussing, can we count the number of words in the Torah and how many are there, which is the middle? Like it's just a by definition limited text because it's a text and all texts are limited. Right? Just by virtue of being a book, it has a certain spatial limitations, and that creates limits on how much it can tell you what to do. Right? The question of what we should do, he's saying, cannot be answered once in all times in all places because there's just too many times and places. Like these societies differ and people differ over time, over the course of our lives, over the course of our context, and simply you will not always be able to include all instructions within any one document. The Torah could not have been infinitely broad, or it would be infinite text, and we'd still be reading it and never have gotten to the end of it. And so my go-to example of this is from last week's Parsha Mishpatim, where there's a discussion of it's a variety but there are all kinds of laws in Parsha Mishpatim, and all of them have to do with forms of society and like parts of society, and many of which are just not around anymore, right? So for most of us, I'm assuming all of us here, but really most of like we don't live in societies where slavery is a legal construct. Similarly, questions of oxen and oxes that injure people might be something that we have legal constructs for in our societies, but the literal animals involved in damaging aren't relevant anymore. And so when people talk with the halachot, they do a lot of analogizing to figure out what are the modern analogies for oxen and fire and things like that. And you find that already in the Gemara. But the Ramban is saying, look, as the world changes, then the specific actions that are right will also change. Just because like the context will change. The description of the situation in which you are trying to act will be different than it used to be. And so, in order to account for the reality of historical and societal change, the Torah included a broad principle. Right? It says that once again, like Kedusha, where all of these values are somehow, all the halachot are somehow embodying that value partially. Here, he wouldn't even say necessarily they're partially embodying that value. So these mitzvot that tell you, he says, don't gossip, don't take vengeance, don't curse the deaf. These are all full embodiments of what it means to be good and right, but they don't exhaust the value. The value would look different in different situations. So the Ramban says, in order that we not think the Torah is exhaustive of good and right behavior, it also articulated it as a general principle. Right, that we should know that even if you're in a situation that feels like it's not covered by the Torah covers it in the broad sense by saying, do what is good and right. He gives two examples that I've bolded at the end of this paragraph, right, is including even compromise and going beyond the requirements of the law. And these in rabbinic Hebrew, it's called bitsua, compromise, and lifnim mishurat hadin. And bitsua is a fascinating, like compromise, a fascinating concept in rabbinic literature because there are some rabbis who are very uncomfortable with the idea because it means you have a situation where the law says to do X and you decide to do Y. You decide to, in some ways, go against the law in favor of the good, right? And that's a deeply jarring idea, right? The idea that halacha is somehow not actually, you follow the strict halacha, it's not going to accomplish what the ultimate goal of halacha is in some ways. Because here he takes us back to the model of sort of contradicting values, that there can be whatever values are embodied in halacha and also the values they're trying to accomplish, and you have to sort of figure out ways of making them work. And then with Nimishurat Hadin is that a very sort of similar idea, but in some ways takes us closer to the model of saintliness, right? Going beyond the requirements of the law is if one person in a dispute was the victor, right? The law was decided in their favor. They should, in some sense, give up some of what is they have rightfully earned according to the law, what's rightfully theirs, in order to create a better society. Like for the sake of this virtue of the right and the good, they should be willing to sacrifice some of what is in some sense rightfully theirs, right? Sort of as it were, move the border between two different, what belongs to this person, this person deserves, and what the other person deserves. One person can choose to be somewhat sacrificial in this context, and that embodies the value of the right and the good. And I left it off the source sheet. I should have sent it anyways. But there's you can find this basic idea that it's impossible to mention all aspects of Torah's conduct and things like that quoted in halachic literature throughout the ages, right? So you can find it in commentaries on the Rambam and places in terms of a lot of what's called shutafut or really civil law, right? That within the context of civil law, halacha gives a lot of room to people to decide how our societies are going to be run. That we can, as groups, and groups as small as as neighbors, but also as large as a community. And in modern Israel, many authorities have actually suggested this as a basis for democracy, is the model of shutafut. That's what it means, like partnership or collaboration, where all of the residents or citizens come together and say, we are going to come up with the law for ourselves. And it's the reason the shutafut is the halacha's model for that, exactly because of this, because not one set of laws could not be right for all times and all places and all contexts. Next, I want to look at a really interesting Rambam. Before that, any questions on the second piece of the Ramban? Okay, I want to do this one. I think is not intuitive. I think it's interesting. This is from Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah. Oh, yes, Helio.
Yes. this is about desecrating God's name. Now the protests in Bnei Brak, Israel, some Rosh Yeshiva said they are desecrating God's name here.
Yeah, so we're talking about desecrating God's name right now. I think it creates some very interesting dynamics.
Thank you.
So this is from the 10th chapter of Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, the laws of the foundations of the Torah. It's the first section of Rambam's Mishnah Torah. He called his great work, it's his book encapsulating all of the laws of the Torah, right? All of halacha. Starts with 10 chapters on the conceptual, theoretical, theological, philosophical foundations of the Torah and of the halacha. And this is from the 10th chapter. And I would say there's discussions of martyrdom, of sacrificing yourself in some ways, of trying to sanctify or avoid desecrating God's name in both the 5th chapter and the 10th. This is from the discussion in the 10th chapter. And he says there are other things included in desecrating God's name. He's talking about what are the things that would count as violating the biblical prohibition of desecrating God's name. Is there things included in desecrating God's name, although they are not of themselves either among the mandatory or prohibitive commandments, right? They're not positive commandments that you have to do or things you're forbidden from doing. As for example, when a great man, famed for his learning and piety, will do something the public will suspect him on account thereof, even though such deeds be not transgressions. Yet he has desecrated God's name, as for example, if he makes a purchase and does not pay for it at once, although he has the money and the vendors are claiming it and he delays them, or if he indulges in frivolity, or eats and drinks with and among the ignorant, or if his speech with his fellow men be not polite, or if he does not receive them pleasantly, but acts as one looking for strife and shows anger. In such and like matters, all measured by the standard of the greatness of such scholars, he must take particular care and act exceedingly better than the law requires. Conversely, if the scholar restrains himself, speaks politely to his fellow man, and when among them, acts like one of them, receives them pleasantly, takes abuse from them and never gives abuse to them in return, respects them even though they do not respect him, acts in business honestly, does not remain in company with the unlearned, nor visits their assemblies, and is rarely seen otherwise than being engaged in the study of Torah, wrapped in the prayer garment and adorned with phylacteries, tefillin, and performs his duties exceedingly more than the law requires, provided he does not go to extremes and not act so ridiculously, so that all praise him and love him and crave to imitate his actions. Behold, he sanctifies the Lord, and concerning this person, the verse says, and God said unto me, you are my servant Israel, in whom I am glorified. Avdi Yisrael becha et pa'er. Right, so the Rambam is laying out the underlying dynamic of the biblical commandment and prohibition of sanctifying God's name and desecrating God's name. He says, sanctifying and desecrating God's name are fundamentally about how God is seen by people and how God is seen to be embodied in certain people in some ways, not necessarily embodied, but somehow associated with, right? And so he speaks towards the beginning of this passage about someone who's recognized as a great man, famed for learning and piety. Towards the end here, he's talking about Jews. And this is actually in a very intense first line of chapter 5. I said chapter 5, he also talks about Kiddush Hashem. Chapter 5 starts with Kol Beit Yisrael Mitzuvim al Kiddush Hashem. That Kiddush Hashem is, in some sense, like in Hilchot Yesodei Torah, part of how Maimonides, Rambam frames what it means to be Jewish, is that God's name is attached to the Jews, and therefore anything Jews do is always going to be wrapped up with the dynamics of Kiddush and Chilul Hashem, sanctifying and desecrating God's name. And what those dynamics are, again, is to be seen by other people to be bad or extreme or ridiculous or then good and pious. But what that does in terms of our discussion of morality and values and proper action is it introduces a set of values and actions and evaluations of actions that are not just not from the Torah, they're from other people who are looking at the people who keep the Torah. They are the values of the surrounding society, surrounding the pious person and surrounding the Jews. So what it means to sanctify God's name is that people should look at you and say, look, those people are great. Like, those are great people. And they're great people, not according to their own standards, but according to our standards. I mean, it's that the surrounding people, their values are, they see them mirrored in the Jews or the pious person like this. And this walks again, because for the most part, this is why this is still in the first section, where even though it's from Rambam, it's in the section of people who don't consider the possibility of the clash between morality and the Torah, right? So this is, Rambam would not say you should necessarily violate the Torah in order to avoid being doing chil Hashem, right? Like that's chil Hashem is also a biblical prohibition. So you got to figure out how you navigate that. But what this means is that there is in fact a biblical injunction, technically two of them, right? A positive commandment and a negative prohibition that mean you should take the values of those people who perceive you into account, right? That what it means to try and represent God in the world is not just to represent God based on the Torah or based on your own values and theologies. It means to represent God with consciousness of the values of the people around you, that those become part of the halachic discussion and the discussion not just halacha, but like what should we do, right? Or how do we determine the proper course of action?
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, perfect.
I mean, this is Rambam, so yeah, but I mean, this seems like such a slippery slope. This seems like minchag becomes halacha, and one society says it's okay if the woman does never leaves the house, and it's terrible if you let your wife leave the house, and if everybody, like the influence of different societies, and then you can have things that, these things crop up. Like, right, for example, in the Muslim world, then, everybody around you and things seep into the Jewish community, and that the woman is not supposed to leave the house. And then that becomes then like halacha and like what morality is.
Yeah, so I first off, I'll say I assume that you're aware, you're almost citing Rambam. That Rambam says basically that a man's wife should rarely go outside too much.
You know what? I did not know that. I only know because I know it just from something else. I didn't even pick that, knowing that, and that's what he says. Okay, and that's
Unless
an example.
Yeah, so now I got myself. Now I'm doubting myself, but I have a memory of it. But it's an offhand comment. It's not something he necessarily gives the status of halacha to. But you're right, right? This is in some ways what a lot of contemporary discourse around halacha and morality will invoke is the question of, well, how do we know that society is doing the right thing? Why should we care about societal values? Don't we need some sort of transcendent, eternal standard for proper behavior?
Mm-hmm.
But much like sort of we talked about last week in terms of trust and how you can't get away from living in society where you have to trust people what you know, you also can't get away from living in society when it comes to questions of, for lack of a better word, reputation, but of Kiddush and Chil Hashem, of God's name, and also of your own, right? Like anything you do will be perceived by people around you. And that affects, how you're seen, which could be taken to be just a matter of sort of personal ego, but it also will affect how society runs, right? And like your ability to be a person in society and have people respond to you and work with you and want to be in, social relations with you and those sorts of things. And so like his model here is of the pious person in society, right? They can't be influential in society in any way if they're seen to be bad or crazy. Right. And so that's why I said like Rambam wouldn't say you should violate halacha for this. And so where exactly you draw the line is complicated. Like how you navigate that. But I think it's just an important factor to take into place here. And I think we're noting that halacha does. That halacha says, look, be aware you live in society, and that should affect your actions in some ways. Again, because
I was going to say, and I also see, you see this, you see it if you're not part of the Haredi community when you live in Israel, because then it's just more in front of you, like the thickness of a woman's stocking, right? And how minchag it becomes almost like halacha to enable you to be within your community.
Yeah, and I think that is part of as much the perplexity or complexity of this idea, which on the one hand is, I think, capturing a very real dimension of what it means to live with other people around you with whom you might not agree or the like, but at the same time creates can create that problem and related problems. Like what if you live in society where there's a variety of different values, right? Your community's values, other communities' values. How do you embody both of those, all those different sets of values, right? How do you make sure you're not, that sanctifying God's name in one person's eyes is not violating it in another? I'm thinking of the general polarization in the world today. American society is a good example, but sociologists have been writing about polarization in Israeli society for upwards of 30 years. Like this is an ongoing problem. And if you live in a bipolar society, a society that has two strong poles, those will often be associated with sets of values. And I'm thinking of Jonathan Haidt's book on moral principles. I don't know what it's called right now. He talks about how I think he uses the categories of liberals and conservatives, but just generally different groups in a society have different sets of moral values that are pulling them in different direction. And like, do they consider holiness a value? Do they consider loyalty a value? And you can't be sanctifying God's name in everyone's eyes all the time. So this is not a easy instruction to follow, but I think it's important.
Mhm.
I also note in that context that part of why I find this striking important comes from my own situatedness here in Israel, where a lot of Orthodox discourse around halacha and morality will say, well, morality is just Western morality, or Christian morality. And like, well, even if that's true, which I don't think is really a fair thing to say, that doesn't get you off the hook. As it were, you have to take other people's morality into account in order to engage with the biblical mitzvot of sanctifying and not desecrating God's name.
Hmm.
So in the 17 minutes we have left, I hope I'm not cutting you off. I want to try and fly through some material. We're going to do it pretty up in the air. Mostly, I think it's like it's interesting and it'll get to important, but also just like a great, I don't know. I'm a huge fan of this, what Rambam's doing here. It touches some of my favorite issues in the Rambam. But we're gonna move kind of quickly. So I've brought here in this section called Halacha between truth and morality, and what this is going to be the underlying framework for Rambam's thinking on this topic, but also for Rambam's entire philosophical and theological religious project. This is two sentences from near the very beginning of his philosophical masterwork, Morrow Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed, where he's discussing what happened to human beings after the first sin, after the fall in sort of Christian terminology. He says, reason discerns true from false. Adam had it fully and flawlessly. But fair and foul, and in some translations, good and bad, are matters not of reason, but of repute. We do not say it is fine that the heavens are spherical or foul that the earth is flat, but this is true and that false. And he's saying before the sin, before they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? The human beings lived according to understanding what is true and what is false. And they acted based on what is true and what is false. And one of his examples of what something that might be a true behavior and also a bad behavior, as it were, is nudity. He says nudity, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with nudity. In society, we think it's bad. And notably, this is what he means when he says repute, right? When we've good and bad, these are not matters of reason, but of repute. In some translations in English, this is convention. Because we shifted from being sort of purely philosophical beings to once again being social beings, to living in societies, and that some of our values, what we think of as good and bad, come from the society around us. Right, so that is Rambam's basic picture of what it means to be a human being in the world, right? Like after the sin of Adam Rishon, what it means to be a human being is to live in society and have values you've absorbed from society that are different from sort of absolute truth of what is actually, he says, true and false. We might say right and wrong behavior, or correct or incorrect behavior. This is from towards the third section of the Morrow Nevuchim, where in the middle of the third section, where he's discussing the purposes of the Torah as embodied in the mitzvot. Like, what are the mitzvot for? Right? I mean, this is when he's talking about what are the reasons for the commandments. So the Torah has two aims: material and spiritual well-being. Spiritual well-being comes when the masses, so far as they are able, attain sound beliefs. Material well-being is won by improving human relations in two ways: by everyone's acquiring traits of character beneficial to society and conducive to civic order. So the first one is in two ways. I've skipped over here, which is just like stopping people from hurting each other. Like, society is better when you stop people from being violent, and also by not just improving people's actions, but also improving their values. But this, three lines here is sort of directly building on and responding to the previous source. That the previous source is about how human beings went from being perfect philosophical beings to being societal beings, people who live in society, and often we act based on values of good and bad, not correct and incorrect. He says the Torah's goal is to undo that fall. The point of the Torah is to turn us back into philosophical beings who make decisions based not on what society has taught us is good and bad, but based on what is true and false, correct and incorrect. Right? That where we are going is towards truth. Right? In some ways, Rambam is a thinker of progress. Right? It's not entirely the right word for it, and we can talk a little bit more about why it's not the right word, but he sees us as trying at least to progress from the, to use a word I used last week, the endarkenment of the first sin towards a vision of universal enlightenment in the Messianic era. And the mitzvot are the engine that drive that progress. And for that, we have to talk about, to understand this process, we have to talk about one last piece from the Morrow Nevuchim here, which is from just a couple chapters later, still in his discussion of the meanings of the commandments. This is a famous passage where he talks about the role of sacrifices and animal sacrifices in the mitzvot. It just is not possible to shift abruptly from one extreme to another, right? In this context, from endarkenment to enlightenment. You can't jump in one fell swoop, because human nature cannot simply drop everything familiar all at once. The familiar mode of worship, the ways we grew up with, prevalent all through the world in those days, meant only sacrificing various animals in the temples whose images were set up, bowing down to them, and burning incense before them. The pious and devout in those days were devoted to service in those temples consecrated to the stars, as I explained. So with grace and wisdom evident all through creation, God's law did not simply annul, reject, and abolish such worship. Human nature, always so attached to the familiar, could not conceive of accepting such a law. It would have been the same to say in those days as if some prophet today, it would have been the same in those days as if some prophet today, in calling people to serve God, were to say, God forbids you to pray, fast, or call on him in distress. Your worship must be meditation alone and no act at all. So God preserved these ways of worship, but shifted them to God's name rather than objects man-made or imagined. What he's saying here is that this is where my third term is going to enter here, right? History. So in some ways we're actually at four terms. We have halacha, truth, and morality, but the extra category here is history. That as human beings, we live in societies which changed throughout their history, and you can hear this was actually present in the Ramban as well, but doesn't make as big a deal of it. And for Rambam, this history is ideally one of progress, but that progress is never pure and you never suddenly jump all the way out of it. You can't just jump out of history. You take slow steps within it. So the purpose of the mitzvot, he says, are to push us towards human perfection. And we're going to talk a little next week about what he has in mind when he talks about human perfection. but he's to push us towards human perfection one step at a time. And so what halacha looks like, he says, is it looks like baby steps away from sin, away from endarkenment, away from, sort of philosophical and moral ignorance towards enlightenment, towards better values and a better world. But those steps are always going to be baby steps. And so what halacha is, when we talk about halacha and morality, what he's immediately saying is that halacha isn't some pure set of values and actions. It's actions and values mixed together with whatever situation the world was in when the Torah was given, right? That necessarily flawed and imperfect world marks the Torah, right? I would say that in Rambam's sense, despite the Torah being absolutely given by God, and he has sort of the most intense formulation of that, of like every word was spoken by God to Moshe, the Torah is also a deeply human document because it's the stuff of the mitzvot, the world the mitzvot speak to and about is a very human world. And so when we talk about for Rambam about, correct values and correct actions, you have to recognize also the world in which we live, the world in which the Torah lives, and the gentle steps necessary for taking ourselves, from those spaces, from reality towards perfection. And he has this really intense little line here, like to have told someone 2,000 years ago not to bring animal sacrifices would be like telling people not to pray to God today and like ask God for help, right? And he was saying this 800 plus years ago, but I think today we would relatively strongly agree with that. That like prayer is still a pretty intuitive part of what we consider to be a religious and worshipful personality. And Rambam was like that could also be seen as just a societal value, and like you have to recognize that what it means to be a person in society is to have your values to whatever degree constructed by society around you. And so that's actually going to be relevant to what we're not going to do inside. We're going to skip this second section. This is from his introduction to his commentary on Pirkei Avot, where he talks about, like, again, are you supposed to agree with the mitzvot intuitively or not? He distinguishes between we might call moral mitzvot and ritual mitzvot, that like moral mitzvot you should identify with and be like, yeah, murder is bad. And ritual mitzvot is like, yeah, you actually, there's some ideal sense in which disagreeing with it is actually better. So it's worth taking a look at on your own. It's a really good piece. We're going to look at some pieces from Rambam quickly, where he talks about morality against halacha. As I said, he's really the only person who recognizes this possibility. And it's because of what he says in this chapter here, which we're not going to read inside. This is just 2 chapters after the discussion of sacrifices, right? And of the progress in mitzvot and progress in history, and mitzvot being part of history. And here he says that the Torah, he says, the law was not given with a view to things that are rare. That's the first line, right? That the law is given, the way law works is law works to govern a group of people over space and time, right? It is meant to speak to a collective. But people are different, right? Within society, some people will find it easier to keep some laws than others, and that will be different for each person, which laws make more sense to you, which ones don't. And in context of the question of historical progress and the mitzvot, what that means, he says, is there will necessarily be some people for whom some laws not only aren't actually perfecting them, it actually may make them worse. It's the purpose of the law is not perfectly achieved in every individual, and the contrary necessarily follows. There should exist individuals and for whom this governance of the law does not make perfect. Right? And you can think of it in terms of sacrifices. The Rambam seems to suggest that sacrifices were an accommodation to a pagan world, right? And that ideally we would never have brought them. Nowadays, we don't need sacrifices. Like we don't feel that intuitive sense that this is, as much as we might still think that prayer is absolutely a good way to worship God. Like that makes sense to us. We don't think that about sacrifices. And yet Rambam is also the halachic authority who wrote down the codified the laws of sacrifices, and he never anywhere says we shouldn't bring sacrifices in the messianic future. Right? These are, as far as he's considered, still on the books. Like that is part of halacha. He says, so someone, and so says all of us at this point are in the state of having, thanks to the Torah, moved past sacrifices. And also the Torah still wants us to bring sacrifices. Right? The Torah creates this contradiction within us because its job is to move us forward through history away from bad values towards better ones. So because of that, he has a radical text going back to, again, Shmona Prakim, his introduction to the Pirkei Avot. This is from the very first chapter. I'm not going to read it inside. Here he tells you the purpose of Pirkei Avot and the purpose of his book on Pirkei Avot is to heal the soul, to make you a good person, the best person you can be. And because of that, it's a form of medicine, not a form of law. It doesn't have that same feature of law that it's supposed to speak to all people all of the time, something like that. And then the broadest case, it actually is supposed to speak to the individual. And therefore, he leaves us with this piece. Remember, I mentioned way back at the beginning that Rav Aaron Lichtenstein has a footnote where he mentions this loose end. It's this one. This is the piece he mentions in a footnote, which is the one place where a Rishon seems to directly grapple with the problem of this contradiction between morality and halacha. He says, if there be a man who has accomplished this, that is one who exerts all the faculties of his soul and directs them towards the sole ideal of comprehending God, using all the person's powers of mind and body, be they great or small, for the attainment of that which leads directly or indirectly to virtue, I would place him on a rank not lower than that of the prophets. Or someone who is turned themselves into the perfect person, who is totally thinking about God and godly values and philosophical values all the time. Such a person, before he does a single act or deed, considers and reflects whether or not it will bring them to that goal, and if it will, then only then do they do it. Such striving does the Almighty require of us, according to the words, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. Right, the Shema. That is, with all the faculties of your soul, each faculty having as its sole ideal the love of God. The prophets similarly urge us on in saying, in all thy ways know him. In commenting upon which the sages said, "Afil devar avera," even as regards a transgression, that you can know God, you can be directed towards the knowledge and love of God, even in transgression, meaning thereby that you should set for every action a goal, namely the truth, even though it be a transgression from a certain point of view. This saying is found among their precepts, as is, let all thy deeds be done for the sake of heaven, right? Let everything you should do should be l'shem shemayim, even an avera. So Rambam can't prescribe this as a law because it's a form of spiritual medicine, as it were. It's purely individual. And he can't in some ways tell us what this is supposed to look like. But as far as I'm hearing, this is important in terms of recognizing the contradiction and that there are real values at play here. We're basically done. I'm going to sum up quickly with what I think are some of the important takeaways. Kayla, I don't know how the schedule is. I could theoretically hang out 5 more minutes if people have questions.
I'm happy to give another 5 more minutes.
But no pressure to people who want to go. But I'll say, so one, this is just an intense Rambam. As someone who's generally skeptical, as I've talked about in the last 2 classes, I would have a hard time ever imagining myself feeling confident I was in that position of I'm the person who knows what the true divine values are. But I think it's really important that because he brings history into this picture, and he, while not making halacha any less absolute, he does complicate the idea that it represents something purely transcendent, right? He says it pulls us toward transcendent truth from within a very human place, where, as I said, it represents baby steps. And at some point, we could even have taken very large leaps and steps beyond it, value-wise, if not in law. But I think that's important. I'll also say I think a lot about this. What does this dynamic do for us? If we think about the Rambam as a thinker of progress who sees halacha as being sort of on the way to progress. So there's a temptation to think about progress as well. We're sort of at the end of it. We look always backwards and where we've progressed from and assume we're not really going anywhere from here. But I think if you take seriously this vision of transcendental values or transcendent values and values somehow beyond our current way of comprehending, Rambam would in many ways first and foremost want us to be critical of societal values. He wants us to hold halacha and morality as both in some sense human constructs. Neither one sort of purely human necessarily. He doesn't think that we should dismiss either one of them, but they exist, both of them in tension with each other sometimes in agreement, sometimes in tension, and both of them as things within this human world, this societal world, not the transcendent divine world that perhaps we had some sort of access to or knowledge of before, sin. So this has all been about complicating the relationship between halacha and morality, between values and actions. I think the Rishonim have a general recognition that it's just not simple. You can't ever talk about just halacha as the whole way to run a society or to decide what you should do. Like there are always just other actions and values in play. And even within halacha, there's a variety of different dynamics at work at any time. So that's my pitch for today. I'm very happy to take some questions from people.
Just there was a question in chat that just wasn't an easy break to bring up from
sorry.
Daniel Mashinsky. Quote, the Gemara's discussion is relevant of how David Melech never, quote, technically sinned in the Bathsheba episode. There are many modern teachers who teach these loopholes literally and absolve David both legally and morality, since the two are equivalent to them.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. One, I'll just note in case people aren't broadly aware, right? There is this voice in the Gemara that says David technically never sinned. Actually, I think it's Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani. There's a bunch of people in Tanakh who seem to have sinned actually didn't sin. And there's plenty of reason to think that the majority of Chazal actually disagreed and would have called it a sin. But part of what's important about holding halacha and morality as two different sort of sets of values and actions that might overlap but might be in tension, and both of which are in play, is this ability exactly to critique, like to recognize the idea that something could be halacha and not moral. And this goes back to the Ramban at the beginning. And I'll just note, in terms of like a broader societal sense, this is the question of law and morality. This is a broad problem. It is not just a Jewish problem, right? If something is legal, does that automatically mean that it is moral? And also, do we want to legislate the things that we think are moral, right? That in some ways, not legislating as law our own morality is really good for living in pluralistic societies. But it also can risk the opposite, which is saying that, like, oh, if something's legal, then it's fine. That way you can't articulate a moral critique of law or society. And the ultimate conclusion to that is that there is no one conclusion. You have to be able to hold these principles in tension and try and resolve them as you can as you go through life.
In a lot of, I don't know, I don't have, hard sources, but there's always the apocryphal, actually, let me back up for a moment. There's this strain of small c conservatism in a lot of discussions of halacha or Jewish learning, meaning stemming from revelation. So the reason why we don't disagree with Rishonim or because they are closer to Revelation. They don't disagree with every step going back all the way back to Har Sinai, and that seems sort of in conflict with what we're seeing in the Rambam here, where there's the idea of there's a progress where we aren't the ones who need to be told that animal sacrifices aren't acceptable. And I mean, if we look back even last week when we talk about what Yehuda Halevi talking about the Kuzari talking about how he accepts social truths not because it was a revelation, but because he trusts the people who trust the people who trust the people who trust the people all the way back to that revelation. And how do we sort of accord those two thoughts where we are progressing beyond the need for things like animal sacrifice or certain laws that are archaic, and the idea that they were closer to a truth that we would have to trust their connection to?
Yeah, so I want to quickly just before I answer you, and note that again, I would say Rambam doesn't think we've necessarily by default moved beyond laws in certain ways. Like he thinks that our values shift, and he has this model of progress. Broadly speaking, what you're referring to is often called Yeridat HaDorot, the descent of the generations. It has, I think, become a much more widespread idea in modern Judaism and modern Jewish understandings of the Jewish tradition. It's not particularly present in a lot of the Rishonim we've talked about so far, even though it might be very amenable to some of their thoughts. So, like as you described, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, his model of trusting tradition would work pretty well with a model of descent of the generations. For Rambam, it absolutely does not. And so there's a scholar named Menachem Kellner who's written just a ton on the Rambam. He has a small book about like Rambam and the descent of the generations, where he's just like, yeah, Rambam could not possibly affirm that idea. Rambam's whole model of us moving from, how it's called, ignorance and obscurity to enlightenment is based on that just not being true. Now, he doesn't necessarily have a like arc of history model where we're necessarily getting more enlightened all the time. It could go up and down. It could be more complicated, but he also doesn't have a strict descent. And I'll say, I think that a variety of thinkers across the Jewish tradition have tried to square what they might take to be intuitive progress, looking at things exactly like the fact that we don't desire to worship idols anymore, with what had become the more popular idea of descent of the generations. So off the top of my head, three thinkers working actually in a more Kabbalistic vein, the Ramchal, Rav Chaim Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, Rav Tzadok Cohen of Lublin, a Hasidic thinker, and Rav Kook, Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook, all have models for trying to think about how we could possibly, like how we could affirm the descent of the generations that we're somehow getting worse in some unclear sense, or in what sense, specific sense, while also obviously getting better in some senses. So because I think Rambam is just like touching on what is a pretty apparent part of religious life in Jewish history, everyone has to, like, it's a very compelling case that, descent of generations is not obviously true. Okay, I think we probably are about out of time. Thank you
Yes,
very
I'm
much,
afraid so.
Kayla, and
Thank
thank you
you
to
so
Drisha.
much.
Thank you everyone for
Okay.
coming.
Thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you all next week for the final class. And I just want to highlight one new class starting this week at Drisha. This Thursday at 1 p.m., Dr. Rachel First will be teaching the Classic Jewish Bookshelf, Part 2, Medieval Masterpieces. This is an excellent continuation of a series she started in the Fallsman. And if you're, available around this time of day, I highly recommend it. Sign-ups are at drisha.org/classes. And see you all for the fourth session next week.